The microphone was set up in a room full of fake fur and tiki carvings and waterfall sounds. And nobody in that room was willing to say what everyone in that room already knew. It was October 1976. Elvis Presley was 41 years old. He had less than 10 months to live, and on a Tuesday night in the converted back room of his own mansion, surrounded by musicians who had followed him for years and a producer who had devoted his career to him, Elvis Presley sat down in front of a microphone and opened his mouth. And what came out was not the voice America remembered. What came out was something older, something broken open, something that had no business being as beautiful as it was. This is the story of the last time Elvis Presley ever made music. Not on a stage, not for a camera, in a room at Graceland that looked like the inside of a fever dream, and what those recordings cost him, and what they left behind, and why the musicians who were there have spent nearly 5 decades trying to find the right words for what it felt like to witness it. The Jungle Room had always been a provocation. Elvis had designed it himself in 1974, in a single afternoon, walked into a Memphis furniture store called Donald's, pointed at everything with carved wood and fake fur and Polynesian overtones, and told them to deliver it all to Graceland. $6,000 in 40 minutes. A room built entirely on impulse, entirely for himself, because he could. But by 1976, something practical had happened to the provocation. Felton Jarvis, Elvis's record producer since 1966, the man who had guided Suspicious Minds and In the Ghetto, had noticed something important about the room's acoustics. The carpet covered the floors and crept up the walls. The waterfall in the corner created a natural ambient dampening that a producer's ear recognized as genuinely useful. They could set up recording equipment here. Elvis could make music at home, in his own room, on his own schedule. Elvis said yes. What Jarvis did not say, what nobody said, was the other reason the idea made sense. The reason that sat in the back of every conversation about Elvis's professional life that fall, acknowledged in glances and careful silences, and the particular way people spoke around the truth rather than through it. By October of 1976, Elvis Presley could no longer reliably leave Graceland. To say that Elvis's health had declined by then is to use language so inadequate it borders on dishonesty. The man who had stood in black leather in 1968 and electrified 42% of the American television audience, who had opened at the International Hotel in Las Vegas in 1969 and been described by critics as the most vital performer alive, was now sustained by a pharmaceutical regimen of staggering complexity. Uppers to wake, downers to sleep, painkillers for the chronic back condition that had plagued him for years, sedatives for the anxiety that lived in his chest like a permanent tenant. His physician, Dr. George Nikopoulos, was not treating Elvis. He was maintaining him, keeping the machine functional enough to perform, to record, to exist within the schedule that Colonel Tom Parker's contracts demanded and that Graceland's operating costs required. And the voice. The voice was the thing nobody could bring themselves to discuss directly. It had dropped, deepened past what aging alone would explain. There was a roughness in it now, a catching quality, as if something in the instrument was deciding, moment to moment, how much cooperation it was willing to give. On bad nights on stage, and there were bad nights now, the voice simply failed, went thin in the high registers, blurred at the edges. But there were other nights. Nights when the damage became something else entirely, when the roughness and the depth and the new rawness of the instrument produced something that the pristine voice of 1957 had never been capable of. A sound that had been through things, that carried its own autobiography in every phrase, a voice reporting back from somewhere real. Felton Jarvis had heard both kinds of nights. As the equipment was assembled in the Jungle Room that October, he was hoping for the second kind. He was not certain which kind he would get. The musicians arrived at Graceland in the early afternoon. David Briggs on piano, Chip Young on guitar, Jerry Kerrigan on drums. Men who had worked with Elvis many times and knew the unwritten rules. Chief among them, that Elvis's emotional state upon arrival determined the temperature of everything that followed, and that reading it accurately was a professional skill as important as any musical one. Elvis came downstairs in the evening, wearing a dark tracksuit. No costume, no performance of arrival. He moved through the doorway of the jungle room and stood looking at the equipment, the microphone stands and cable runs, and the modest console Jarvis had assembled, with an expression that those present would describe differently in different accounts, but that all converged on the same essential quality. He looked like a man who was not sure his body was going to cooperate tonight. He sat down in a chair positioned near the primary microphone, not standing. He had been standing less lately, and nobody commented on it. Jarvis ran through the material. The songs assembled for what would become the Moody Blue album, Way Down, a driving piece with real energy in it, Pledging My Love, the Johnny Ace ballad from 1954 that Elvis had circled for years. He'll Have to Go, the old Reeves standard, songs selected with care by a producer who understood that the instrument he was working with required particular handling now. Songs that would not demand the impossible. Elvis looked at the sheet, said nothing for a moment. Then he asked for the room to be dimmed. It was a request Jarvis had heard before. Elvis had asked for low lights at the recording of If I Can Dream in 1968. He had never explained it then, and he did not explain it now. It was simply a condition he required. The lights went down. The jungle room, already strange and full illumination, became something else in the half-dark. The carved wooden faces and the shag walls and the sound of the artificial waterfall, creating a space that felt sealed from the larger world in a way Jarvis understood. Intuitively, Elvis needed. Elvis put on the headphones. He closed his eyes, and he began. The first complete take of the night was Way Down. It is a song about desire and descent, about being pulled somewhere inevitable by a force you cannot name and would not resist even if you could. Written with a propulsive physical momentum, it was the kind of song that, in the hands of a healthy Elvis in his prime, would have been an exercise in pure showmanship. All control, all execution. What Elvis did with it in the jungle room that October was not showmanship. The low end of his voice had become, by this point, extraordinary. A bass baritone depth that the lighter tenor of his early recordings had given no hint of. When he hit the descending line in the chorus, it did not land where technical correctness would have placed it. It landed somewhere further down, somewhere that felt earned rather than executed. Jarvis sat at the console and did not move. The musicians exchanged a glance, the quick, private, professional acknowledgement of people who have just heard something happen that cannot be manufactured. You either have it in a take, or you do not. And on Way Down, on a Tuesday night in October, in a fake Polynesian room in Memphis, Tennessee, it was there. They recorded it again twice, because the obligation is always to try for better. But when Jarvis listened back later, alone, it was always the first take he returned to. The one where Elvis did not yet know it was going to work. The one where the uncertainty was still in him, and the voice carried it. Pledging My Love was harder. It is a slow, open, exposed song, a ballad with nowhere to hide, no tempo to carry you through the vulnerable places, no arrangement dense enough to insulate the voice from scrutiny. You either have the instrument for it, or you do not. And on the early takes, Elvis did not have it. He knew immediately. He had always possessed precise self-knowledge about recordings, one of his oldest professional qualities, dating back to the Sun Studio sessions with Sam Phillips, was his ability to tell in real time whether a performance had the living thing in it or only the technical execution of one. On 2 early takes, he stopped himself before the first chorus. He made a small, economical gesture with one hand. They reset. On the 4th take, something shifted. He stopped fighting the limitations. He stopped reaching for the Elvis who had recorded Can't Help Falling in Love or Love Me Tender. He sang as the man he was in October of 1976, 41 years old, in the room he had built for himself in the back of the house where he would die 10 months later. The roughness was in the performance. The weariness was in the performance. The beauty of the song was inseparable from the evidence of what it had cost the singer to reach it. Chip Young, years afterward, said he had played on hundreds of recording sessions across a career spanning decades. He said he had been in rooms where famous people made music he admired. He said that October Night in the Jungle Room was the only session where he had felt, during the actual recording, not in retrospect, that he was watching something he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to people who were not there. He said he did not think Elvis knew how good it was. He said that might have been the reason it was that good. The session ran past midnight. By the end, Elvis was visibly depleted. The people around him began the quiet coordination that had become routine, managing the physical cost of what he had just asked of his body. The doctor's visit that followed sessions now as a matter of course. He sat for a while after the final take, not listening to playback, not reviewing anything, just sitting in the half-dark with the microphone stand in front of him and the waterfall doing its soft, meaningless work in the corner. Felton Jarvis sat beside him. What was said between them belongs to that room and those two men. Jarvis spoke of it only obliquely in later interviews, acknowledging the conversation existed, declining to reconstruct it with the reticence of someone protecting something that felt too private for the public record. What is known is that Elvis stood up eventually, stretched carefully, and told the musicians good night with the genuine warmth that never left him regardless of what was happening inside the body or the mind. He thanked the guitar player by name. He thanked the drummer by name. He thanked Felton Jarvis in a way that Jarvis would say, decades later, felt slightly different from the routine professional thanks of a working session. Felt like something that was also, quietly, something else. Then he went upstairs. The Jungle Room went quiet. Way Down was released in June of 1977. Elvis Presley died on August 16th of that year at Graceland at 42 years old. The song was sitting at #1 on the country charts the week the news came out of Memphis. Radio stations across America found themselves in the strange position of playing the most recent recording of a man who had just died. The last song of a career that had begun in 1954 and had produced more cultural transformation than any single American artist before or since. People who heard Way Down on the radio in the days after August 16th described something they struggled to name. The voice in the song did not sound like the young Elvis. It did not sound polished or controlled, or like the product of a man at the height of his powers. It sounded like a man who had been somewhere real, somewhere hard, and had come back just long enough to leave a record of the trip. Music historians who have studied the technical dimensions of that final recording have written about the lower register Elvis achieved, the particular tonal quality of an instrument that has been altered by time and damage, but that, in the alteration, found something the earlier version could never have accessed. A voice that had to break before it could say what it needed to say. Elvis Presley had been famous since he was 21 years old. He had spent the following 2 decades as public property. His face, his voice, his body, his grief and excess, all of it consumed and archived and sold back to itself by a culture that believed it owned him because it had decided it needed him. He had very rarely, in all of those decades, been left alone in a room to make something without the weight of expectation attached to it. In the Jungle Room, in October of 1976, in a room full of fake fur and failing light and the sound of manufactured water, he made something, not for Colonel Parker, not for the tour schedule or the contract obligations or the 40 arenas still waiting. For whatever reason, a man who is already, on some level, in the process of saying goodbye, continues to reach for the thing that brought him into the world in the first place. He put on the headphones. He closed his eyes. He sang. The tapes still exist. You can hear them. You can hear in them the exact distance between who Elvis Presley had been and who he was in those final months. And if you listen carefully, in the part of yourself that understands what it costs to make something honest, you will notice that the distance is not only loss, some of it, strangely, impossibly, is arrival.